Hello guys, welcome to Uzumaki Legends. In this video we will see, what if Naruto traveled back in time and became Konoha's silent assassin? Part 1. If you enjoy these kinds of fanfics, please hit the like button and subscribe the channel for more fanfics like this. And now without any further delay, let's start the fanfic. No, wait, what are you doing? I'll pay you twice as much as whoever hired you. No. The panicked man's cries were cut off abruptly as a kunai severed his carotid artery. Blood spatters rained across the sign behind his chair, of which only the letters, "She," were visible. The man had only a few moments to look in disbelief at his killer, before he slumped to the ground, a pool of blood slowly spreading outwards. Casually wiping away the blood on his blade, his killer stepped back, looking on sadly as his victim expired. He'd never even know exactly why he'd been targeted, and probably wouldn't have believed the answer anyway. He didn't like killing. In fact, he generally avoided the practice entirely. This was different. Slipping his kunai back in its sheath, the shinobi quickly made his way up the wall, departing the house through one of the windows on the second floor, different to the one he'd entered through. It would take only minutes for guards to track down the man screaming, and discover the body, but that was quite enough. Still, he needed to hurry. He couldn't afford to be seen anywhere nearby. Wrapping his dark clothes closely around himself, he quickly made his way across two roofs and onto the rather unimpressive wall that surrounded the compound. It was certainly not as remarkable as Konoha's, and the guard detail took minutes to make a full sweep. That was a lethal mistake when dealing with shinobi, who took advantage of even second-long periods of inattention. Drawing two kunai, he tossed himself over the wall, impaling the sharp implements into the wall and riding them down to the ground, setting down right next to the small stream that served as the compound's water supply. There was a certain irony to it. Kunai like these were first used to dig holes into walls, not unlike this one, not as weapons. There was a sudden clamor up above, which meant the murder had been discovered. Quicker than he'd anticipated, but not nearly fast enough. Tossing his overcoat and hood aside, the shinobi dived headfirst into the stream, forcing his way through the current. The coursing water would wash away any traces that tracking ninja or dogs might follow. Raised voices slowly receded in the distance as he forced himself to keep going. When the lights were finally out of sight, and the night was silent once more, he got back onto land. He wrung out his clothes and inspected his kunai. They weren't made of iron, but keeping them clean was paramount for their effectiveness, he knew. Mission complete, the shinobi whispered to himself, smiling wryly as he gazed back, the wall he'd just descended barely visible on the horizon. For a moment, he enjoyed the slight drizzle, fitting weather for such a dreary act. Technically, what he'd just done had been a crime, a pretty severe one, actually. Assassination of civilians was always questionable, but without even the authorization of a Kage or daimyo, he would probably have to face the death penalty if anyone found out. Not that anyone would. He was good enough to escape attention, especially when there were no shinobi involved. Still, it was the principle of the thing. Not that he felt terribly guilty about what he'd done. He was a shinobi. Assassination and stealth were all too common in missions. Besides, he did have a little information that others didn't. His victim hadn't been innocent. Not at all. Things would take a turn for the better, around here. Nobody would know who to thank, but that was all right. Perhaps the Land of Waves would attribute the sudden boon to their lost hero, Kaiza. He could definitely live with that, if it gave Inari some much-needed closure. It didn't really matter, since Gato's grip on them was at an end now, and far sooner than the last time. He let out a curse as he suddenly realized he'd probably just nixed his chance of having a bridge named after him. Damn it! Uzumaki Naruto shook his head tiredly, beginning the long run back to Konoha with a muttered curse. He had a genin exam to get to. Why do you think that idiot's not here? Kiba wondered, glancing around the class. Everyone else was already present, and Iruka tapped his foot impatiently. He's almost out of time. Who cares? Sakura piped in. Can't we just get started, Iruka-sensei? Iruka frowned, rubbing his forehead tiredly. It figured that his most problematic student would be late again. We'll just give him a few more minutes. I am still organizing things, anyway. He grumbled as he sorted through a pile of test scores. Where's Mizuki-sensei? Choji wondered, snacking on a potato chip. You said he'd be testing us too, didn't you, sensei? Iruka frowned, looking away. For a few long moments he remained silent. Then he turned back, and he sighed. I'm afraid to tell you that Mizuki-sensei is no longer with us. He sat down on his chair, hard, and shook his head. Shikamaru blinked and sat up. He's dead. Iruka nodded darkly. I'm afraid he was found in his bed. A few days ago, the Hokage chose to keep it largely silent until yesterday, as it might have been an assassination. He slumped a little. The medical nin said it was natural, though. I suppose that's sometimes what happens. So troublesome, Shikamaru muttered as he sat back in his chair. Quite a few of the other students looked a little pale, though he couldn't quite figure out whether or not it was fear at the thought of death, or just expiring in bed. He was sure which one it was where Sasuke was concerned, though. I'm here, Naruto exclaimed suddenly, crashing through the door and almost toppling over his feet. The boy skidded to a halt and tried to smile. Sorry, I had to go back home real quick, to put on some new clothes. You're not wearing orange, Shikamaru observed. Naruto turned and smiled brightly. Actually, I kind of ruined that one on an assassination mission, so I had to get a new set of clothes from home. He laughed as Shikamaru shook his head in disbelief, and scratched the back of his head nervously. Okay, you got me, I was climbing on the roofs and… Naruto turned, his eyes wide. Iruka-sensei. Sorry I'm late, but I'm sure you just heard why. I had a totally legit, good reason. Iruka sighed wearily. Naruto. Just get in line. He turned to the others and gestured behind him. For the graduation exam, you'll do the Bunshin no Jutsu, the clone technique. I'll be in the next room. When you're called, just come out, and you'll know if you pass right away. He rifled through his papers, and gave up. I'll just go by order of your papers, here, so get ready to be called any time. What a drag, Shikamaru commented, as one by one different students left through the door to take the test, until only a handful were left. He turned to the blonde. So, Naruto, why did you really ditch the orange? The black's cool, but I figured you didn't like it. Naruto smiled nervously. I totally told the truth about that. I was going up on the roofs, and one of those masked guys almost caught me. He hooked a kunai into my suit, so when I escaped it got all torn up. Besides, this was the only other color I had. Masked guys. Anbu, Shino muttered, drawing attention. He adjusted his glasses and nodded to Naruto. They were after you. I sort of painted the monument, Naruto said, smiling broadly. They'll take forever to figure out how to get it back to normal. You're such an idiot, Shikamaru said. Now, the truth, Naruto. Uzumaki Naruto, Iruka called. For a split second relief flashed across Naruto's face, before he got to his feet and smirked to Shikamaru. Good luck at your own exam. You'll have to do the Bunshin, Naruto. Iruka said apologetically, worriedly looking at the blonde. He'd failed twice before, and his chances didn't look much better, now. I know it's not your greatest strength, but… that's what you think. Naruto stuck out his tongue, flashing through hand signs. Bunshin no Jutsu. 5 clones popped into existence surrounding Naruto in puffs of smoke, each of them smiling broadly. For a few moments, there was absolute silence. Then one of them crumpled to the floor. Naruto glanced at it and shook his head in disappointment. Still, the 4 others were intact. Very well done, Naruto. Iruka commented, blinking. I didn't think you'd mastered that jutsu. The last time I saw you try it, they all looked like the sickly one, there. I can't make just one, Iruka-sensei, Naruto admitted sheepishly. You never said how many there had to be, though. But it's good, right? I pass, right? He leaned forward eagerly. Iruka frowned. Jutsu being easier with more chakra wasn't really how it usually worked. The only reason that more clones would work better was if. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. It figured that Naruto of all people would have an overabundance of chakra, considering his burden. Naruto, how many bunshin can you make? I never actually tried that. Naruto admitted. I could try, but I'm sure it'd be lots. I'm sure it would be, Iruka answered, frowning. He forced a smile, picking one of the hitai from a side table and looking over it briefly, glancing up at the grinning blonde. You successfully performed the technique. That means you pass. Congratulations. Third time's the charm, after all. Naruto accepted the forehead protector, and immediately replaced his goggles with his new acquisition. Iruka-sensei, will you come eat at Ichiraku's later? To celebrate. Iruka hesitated, and then nodded. Of course. I'm sure that Chuki-san will have a great big bowl for you, for becoming a ninja. Now, there are a few others that still need to be tested, so go out to the others, and see who might be on your team. He smiled. I wonder if they'll be surprised that you passed. Naruto was out of the room and whooping at the top of his lungs, and Iruka shook his head in amusement at the boy's antics. It was still hard, sometimes, looking at the boy and forgetting about all the misery that he was a reminder of. Still, the blonde had never been cruel or malevolent, quite the opposite, actually. He pitied the team that would end up with that ball of energy. He turned back to his papers and groaned. Nara Shikamaru was next. How would he convince him that taking this test was worth his time? The dead last passed. Ino wondered, glaring at Naruto as he entered the courtyard, shiny hitai on his forehead. Who'd have guessed? Well, after 3 tries, Sakura said, glancing the other way, to a dark-haired boy leaning against the wall. Sasuke-kun passed as well. I'm sure I'll be on his team. It'll be amazing. She grinned at Ino and prodded her in the side. Can you imagine being on one team with him? Ino grumbled. I still say I'll be on his team, not you. You don't even have any special skills, unless supreme bitchiness is one. Ino pig. Sakura growled, raising her fist. Hey, Sakura, Ino. Naruto interrupted their impending fight, and both turned their glares on him. He shuddered nervously, though his grin wouldn't go away. Ah, you both passed as well, then. Naruto, go bother someone else, Sakura said, scowling. Even if you have a forehead protector, you're still the dead last. Maybe you should go hang out with Choji, or something. Hey, there's no need to insult Choji, Naruto muttered. Sakura-chan, you know that you could get on a team with anyone, right? We could even get on one team, and then we need to get along anyway. You could also be with Choji, for that matter. He looked towards Ino. You too. There's no guarantee that you'll be with Sasuke. Since when did you get all logical? Ino said, sighing. I can do that too, you know. There's only a few girls here, of course one of us will be with Sasuke-kun. Do you think they'd put him with Hyuga Hinata? She can't even look you in the eye without stuttering. Well, don't say I didn't warn you, Naruto noted, turning away. At the last moment, he turned back and winked. Sakura-chan, want to go out, now that we're shinobi? Naruto, you idiot, I'll take that as a maybe. Sakura muttered in annoyance as Naruto wandered off towards Shikamaru and Shino, both of whom were attaching their own hitai to their clothing. Sakura sighed. He can be such a pain, sometimes. Where were we? Ino wondered, glancing back at her rival. Oh, right, forehead girl, I will be on Sasuke-kun's team. Naruto exhaled wearily as he made his way back to his home, skipping from roof to roof with the ease of a chunin. It was exhausting, getting back into his childhood role. He'd not been a genin for such a long time. It was quite a novel experience to be one again. It was strange to see all the familiar faces of his later friends and allies at such a young age again, especially the ones he worked the most with. Sakura. She was exactly how he remembered her, precisely how she'd been until at least the original Chunin exams, perhaps longer. She didn't even show a hint of the medical ninja she'd grown up to be, but that wasn't a surprise. She'd probably get back to that at some point in the future, though right now Naruto wasn't sure if she'd even end up on the same team as before. That was the trouble with changing things. Shikamaru hadn't changed a bit. Still the lazy genius, Shikamaru was already putting question marks behind something as comparatively minor as his change of clothes, as expected from the future Jonin commander. Honestly, Naruto had simply chosen the new clothes because he was used to them, and he hadn't had time to change after returning from the land of waves. Assassination missions being what they were, the dark colors didn't show blood as much, and they served as a good camouflage. Technically it was dark blue, though in the bright light that was hard to make out. It was a horrible job, trying to clean these clothes. Thankfully they'd remained unsoiled, this time. The rest of the class was pretty much as he expected. There were hints of their future careers and specialties, but not much more. Hinata was still the recluse. He'd have to fix that, and Sasuke was the elitist Uchiha he'd always been. He didn't show much of the insanity that marked the boy's later life and death, so there was perhaps a chance to change fate, there. It depended on the teams, now that he'd upset events by taking out a number of dangers before they could really become such. Probably there wouldn't be too much of a difference, but it was a probability game. He'd started fixing things with Mizuki. Sneaking in and using medical jutsu against him was effective enough, and the wounds of a butchered chakra scalpel technique were easy enough to hide, if you knew how. Granted, Naruto didn't have the sort of chakra control he'd really need to fix something, but that had hardly been his goal. Imprecise use of medical techniques was a pretty effective way of nigh-invisible kills. He'd briefly felt bad about resorting to such a brutal method of solving his problems, but he was hardly squeamish about that kind of violence anymore, and it was a far better choice than leaving him alive to terrorize the village again. Next, of course, had been Gato. Successful as the mission might have been according to the Hokage, the first time he'd gone out there, the wave mission had resulted in the deaths of both Zabuza and Haku. Those two people could make an actual difference in future events, especially where Kiri was concerned, so keeping them alive was a good idea. Solving Tezuna's problem with his bridge before it even arrived, and taking out an awful person, thereby undercutting the entire mission. Naruto hadn't thought twice about it. These two had been the easy targets. Naruto jumped into his apartment through one of the windows, dropping onto his bed immediately, and letting out a deep sigh. He frowned as he thought about all the things he still had to do. Kabuto was still out there, somewhere. Unlike the others, the medical ninja frequently slept with numerous other shinobi close by in the same building, and Naruto didn't have the poisons at his disposal that would have made it a cinch, assuming Orochimaru hadn't given him the means to become immune to those yet. The snake Sannin was on his list as well. He'd have to figure something out, as that particular shinobi was rather beyond his skills in this smaller body. Having superior chakra control and knowledge could help with a lot, even boosting his speed and strength beyond usual genin limits, but he still had his weak-ass body to deal with. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Naruto murmured, and 3 solid clones popped into existence. 2 immediately used henge to turn themselves into rather nondescript villagers, and left. The last of the clones shrugged and sprawled out on the bed. The real Naruto smirked, snatching a hood from his closet and quickly putting it on. "I'll be back before team announcements." "Of course you will be, boss. Remember the dinner with Iruka-sensei, okay? Also, keep an eye out for Kakashi. If he's going to be our sensei again, he might be watching. Don't want to let him in on this whole game before it's necessary, right?" "I'm not stupid." "Well, not that stupid," Naruto answered indignantly. "I think it's time I sent a letter to an old friend. Shouldn't take too long." The clone chuckled. "Good luck with that. I think we'll just have to smack some sense into him again, you know. It worked before." Naruto shrugged, turning back with sharp eyes. "Maybe I'll consider fetching some new reading material, the other stuff's getting rather stale. If the old man comes by, don't be an asshole. I'm you, I can't be. As you're well aware, I can be an asshole." Naruto paused. "I just insulted myself, fantastic." He sighed, jumping out the window and leaving a bemused clone to count sheep and act as an alibi. It didn't take long for loud snoring to break the silence of the apartment. 1, 2. Naruto flipped over the railing, landing as softly as he could. His legs protested against the strain as he slowly made his way over to the window. Walking on tiptoe along the thin edge was difficult enough without the disadvantage of having received practically no physical training of note. Reaching the edge at last, he grasped it tightly and just held on for a few moments. This seemed way easier the first time around, he muttered to himself as he vaulted over the edge and into one of the longer hallways of the Hokage's tower, where Anbu would only patrol every 10 minutes, instead of constantly. The genjutsu he'd put on himself should be sufficient to ward off unsuspecting eyes, but it was nowhere near enough to ward off any serious search, so he'd need to be quick and silent. The walls were covered in scrolls, hundreds and hundreds of them. Of course, removing them was asking for serious trouble. The only reason he'd gotten away with it the first time was probably sheer luck. Still, he'd been a genin, then, luck or not, he certainly had to be able to do better this time, considering his experience. Walking over to the back of the hallway, he quickly found the Fuinjutsu scrolls. They were the best protected of all, aside from perhaps the forbidden scrolls, and if he didn't want to get caught like last time, he couldn't set off any alarms. This wasn't the first time he'd gotten in here since he'd returned. The first day he'd taken the forbidden scroll, perusing it for the few techniques that he'd wanted to learn the first time around, but never did. He had them transcribed on one of his own scrolls, but getting around to learning those was of later concern. Circumventing that scroll's defenses had almost been too easy. If he was successful again, today, he'd report the problem to the Hokage, and he'd get some kick-ass Fuinjutsu scrolls that he hadn't read yet. Both were good. Right, here we go. Muttering under his breath, Naruto quickly scanned the slips attached to the scrolls, and identified a few interesting ones. They would probably be too difficult to follow. They usually were, but reading this particular handwriting had something special, and he really wanted to have something of the man. Namikaze Minato, the Yondaime Hokage, and his father. Hope you don't mind, Dad. It's for a good cause. He formed the all-too-familiar hand sign, and 3 shadow clones popped into existence next to him, each reflecting his own black attire and hood. Giving a single nod, each briefly studied the scrolls, and used henge. 3 duplicate Fuinjutsu scrolls were left behind, and Naruto grinned victoriously as he picked up the first one. Now, I only have a short time, Naruto mumbled, grabbing the first of his father's scrolls. He yanked it out and stuffed the shadow clone one back in the same slot, his heart racing as he waited for several long, drawn-out seconds. No alarm, no Hokage. He let out a sigh of relief, quickly stuffing the scroll behind his belt and grabbing the second shadow clone. Repeating the procedure twice more, 3 shadow clones now occupied the slots. By the time they dispelled, he'd be long gone. Mission complete, he said to himself as he hurried back to the window, leaping out and landing on the next building over in a crouch. It wasn't until several minutes had passed, and the tower wasn't alight with activity, that he allowed himself to relax. The defenses in the Hokage Tower definitely needed some work, then. Well, he'd get around to talking to the old man about that. But not until after he'd perused his new acquisitions. High above him, looking down on the village from the roof of his tower, Sarutobi Hiruzen looked after the departing boy. He puffed on his pipe, following him until he went out of sight. Then, he smiled. I'm here, Iruka-sensei. Naruto stormed into Ichiraku's, jumping onto a stool and catching himself before he could topple over. He smiled brightly, running a hand through his mop of blonde hair. Sorry I'm late. No problem, Naruto, Iruka said softly. I hadn't started yet. Wouldn't be right without you, would it? It's a celebration, after all. Naruto nodded gleefully. Finally, I'm a Konoha ninja. Now, nothing stands in my way to my ultimate goal. Iruka smiled as Chuki arrived with 2 full bowls of miso ramen. Naruto attacked it like a voracious animal, loudly thanking the chef for making the food of the gods. Still the one-track mind, Naruto. still intent on becoming the next Hokage. Of course. Naruto stopped eating for a moment to give Iruka an incredulous look. What did you think? That I was just going to go back on my word when I got this hit I ate? No way. Someday you'll see that my face is on that cliff. He pointed excitedly at the Hokage monument. The old man believes I can do it, so that's enough for me. Iruka sighed. Still the disrespect for the Hokage, Naruto. That won't get you any closer to his position, you know. He doesn't mind. Naruto shrugged, emptying his bowl in one massive gulp, and quickly grabbing a second, which Tsuki had kindly already set aside for him. I wonder what the teams will be, though. Do you know anything about that? I bet my team will be something lame, like Ino and Kiba. Even if I knew, you can find out with everyone else tomorrow. Iruka tapped him on the head and gave a friendly smile. Perhaps, if you train well enough, I'll call you by a title someday. No slacking off, though, or you won't ever get it. You'll need to put all your energy in important things. Right, Naruto exclaimed, devouring a second bowl of ramen like it was nothing. Protect the village like everyone in it is my family. Be a leader that people look up to because of respect and awe, rather than fear. At Iruka's inquiring look, Naruto smirked. The old man told me that. Well, the old man, I mean, the Hokage would know. Iruka sedately ate the rest of his bowl, as Naruto began his next, and then another one. Hey, Naruto, I could give you a little hint that you might find useful for your first day as genin. He smiled thinly, rubbing his nose. What's the greatest tool a shinobi possesses? Think about it, Iruka said. If you can figure it out before tomorrow, I'll be impressed. I'll definitely figure it out, Naruto declared. The greatest tool, kunai, maybe, shuriken. How about ninja wire? That's extremely useful. Wait, do jutsu count? Tomorrow, Naruto, Iruka admonished. I'll see you when you get assigned to a team. Don't stay up too late. I won't. Naruto gobbled up his last bowl of ramen, and stood up. I'll definitely be on the best team, and then I'll make sure I'll be the best shinobi in it. He looked down at his black clothes and frowned. Definitely need some more orange, though. Can't go to the academy like it's a funeral. Iruka chuckled. I think your new look is pretty nice. Makes you look like a real shinobi. I am a real shinobi, Naruto quipped, tapping his hit I ate. Well, I'll see to some more orange anyway. Without it, it's just not normal. Bye, Iruka-sensei. Wait. Iruka sighed as the boy leapt out of the ramen restaurant, his bright hair the last visible part of him as he disappeared into an alleyway across the street. Turning back to the bar, he gulped. 9 empty bowls of ramen were stacked up precariously, and nobody had paid for them. This was going to hurt, right in the wallet. Starting today, you are all ninja of the hidden leaf, Iruka announced, pacing in front of the class. Sakura and Ino were muttering about their places, while Naruto looked on tiredly, plucking at his black and orange suit idly. It was close enough to the jumpsuit he'd received from Curvy Sage, during their training trip. With a smile he recalled his travels with Jiraiya of the Sannin. This time around, he intended to keep the man around for much, much longer. He'd considered ditching orange entirely. It'd be a pain to put on new clothes every time he got sneaky, but he found that he couldn't. He just wasn't the same person without at least some of it. Naruto yawned loudly. He'd spent most of his night reading the scrolls he'd pilfered, trying to get some idea of what they were even about, but they were a little beyond him. His fuinjutsu skills, however impressive compared to probably anyone else in the room, certainly weren't up the fourth's level, not that he'd really expected them to be. Perhaps someday he'd be able to read those scrolls, and decipher what his own father had written. Naruto was torn out of his thoughts as Iruka stared sharply at him, and he forced himself to pay attention. You will follow your sensei's instructions, as you complete your assigned duties. We've tried to even out the teams, so that they're all about the same strength. Iruka smiled as several people called out in horror. Quote, after the first few teams, Naruto already saw what was going on. Everything was exactly as it was last time, not a bit had changed in any of the teams. Well, not getting in the same team as Sasuke had probably been wishful thinking on his part. Next team. Haruno Sakura, Uzumaki Naruto, Sakura groaned. And Uchiha Sasuke. Hell yes, Sakura called out, punching the air in victory. Naruto looked over at his two teammates with a sigh, thoroughly unsurprised. Sasuke didn't spare him a glance, staring into space like he always did, and Sakura was making faces to Ino, who seemed inconsolable. Then she turned to Naruto, and grimaced. Well, this was going to be fun. Iruka quickly rattled off the other teams, which were the same as always, figured. Finally he was done, and looked out over the class. Okay, this afternoon, we'll introduce the Jonin sensei. Before that, though, I have question. Consider it extra credit, if you wish. Extra credit, after we've graduated. Shikamaru muttered. Too bothersome. Wake me when he's done. Iruka rolled his eyes. This question is something that you must keep in mind. It's something you should consider when you meet your sensei. What is a shinobi's greatest tool? There was a brief silence, as several of the genin muttered to each other. Naruto stared at Iruka, who glanced in his direction, smiling encouragingly. Anyone care to make a guess? It has to be the kunai. They're the most used out of all the shinobi's tools, a girl offered. Naruto realized he actually didn't even know her name. All that vaguely came to mind was that she was one of the genin that hadn't made it through the invasion at the Chunin exams. Something that, if he had anything to say about it, wouldn't happen again. That's wrong. Anyone else? Perhaps, Chakra. Hinata offered, cringing slightly. It is, the most important for all ninja skills, isn't it? A good guess. Not many would consider naming chakra a tool. Unfortunately, it is wrong, again. Anyone else? There was some shuffling of feet. Anyone. The mind. Naruto said, barely audible. Iruka turned to him with eyebrows raised. Naruto shrugged, and spoke up. The mind is the ultimate tool of the shinobi. Without it, all the jutsu and weapons would be pointless. Very good, Naruto. Several genin stared at Naruto, and he fidgeted. Iruka coughed in his hand, tapping his hitai. The mind, the intellect. That is where we plan, where we process, where we feel. There are shinobi that do not use kunai, they are no less for it. There are shinobi who do not use chakra, or who can only use it in a very limited fashion, and yet they are no less for it. But, there is no shinobi of note, who doesn't use their mind. You'd better remember it. Naruto smiled widely as Iruka sat back down, occasionally glancing at him with a look that he couldn't quite identify, perhaps pride. Whatever it was, even if he hadn't been acting like his younger self, he'd have been hard-pressed to get rid of his elation. He had plans, plenty of them. He'd been thinking about what to do for the last few days, and his shadow clones were busy preparing a few of those ideas right now. One letter was on its way to Suna. He didn't know if it'd ever reach its target, but at least he'd try, before the exams. One more letter was headed to Kumo, and he was pretty sure that one would arrive. It'd be interesting to see what the response would be. His last letter, well, he hadn't sent it yet, but he was considering it. Compared to the other two, the risk was far greater, so perhaps he'd simply hand it over in person. If things stayed anything like he remembered them, he'd get the chance. Now, though, it was time to wait for his Jonin sensei. Considering his team was no different, that meant, damn, this was going to take forever. He let out an annoyed groan slumped on his desk, hoping that something, anything he'd done, had made some impact on Kakashi's chronic tardiness. What are you reading, dead last? Sasuke asked. Nearly an hour after the other genin had left, only Team 7 remained behind. Naruto looked up, blinking. Oh, it's just a book I found. I thought with all the waiting, I might as well. He tapped it and smiled. It's quite interesting, it has lots of information on all kinds of shinobi. Information on shinobi, Sasuke repeated, frowning. What exactly? Hello there. A man suddenly said at the door. Naruto smiled widely as he recognized the masked visage of Kakashi, one eye looking over his three students with interest. My first impression. I don't like you. He gestured behind him. Let's get to the roof. Naruto sighed, following the man without complaint. At least, he reasoned, his choice of literature beat that of his senseis. Sakura and Sasuke weren't far behind, looking at their new teacher uncertainly. It was actually sort of amazing, Naruto considered, how innocent they all really were, at this point. So, Kakashi said as the four arrived at the roof. Naruto plopped down on the side, quickly turning the pages on his book, searching for a particular page. The teacher noticed, of course, and glanced over. What are you doing there? Ah, I thought I'd seen. Ha, here you are. Naruto declared victoriously. Hitaki Kakashi, copy nin of Konoha. B rank Jonin. He frowned. Man, you got old since this picture, sensei. I haven't been a B rank in 15 years, Kakashi said, blinking. What's that book? A bingo book. Yup. I found it in one of the training grounds. Naruto said. He'd better not admit he'd taken it from Mizuki's house, not that the man would have much more use for the thing. It's a really old one, I think, since it has all these cool shinobi that aren't around anymore. He flipped the page, showing a picture of a much younger Kakashi, side by side with a boy that was unmistakably an Uchiha. Hold on. I think we should begin introductions, now. You can read your book later. Kakashi admonished. No, this is cool, my favorite ninja of all is in here. Look, he even has a special warning, all for himself. He turned the book to the others, smiling widely. A picture of the fourth Hokage wielding one of his special kunai covered the entire page, labeled only, flee on sight. Someday I'll be a Hokage too. Uzumaki Naruto, the fifth Hokage. I'll be just as cool as him. He imitated the solemn pose that the fourth had in his picture, and was gratified to note that Sasuke suddenly blanched, and Kakashi looked decidedly uncomfortable. Bingo. Step 1 in getting Sasuke's damn attention, successful. Everyone knows about your silly goal to be a Hokage, Sakura muttered. There's nothing silly about such goals, Kakashi interrupted suddenly, frowning. If he wants to be a Hokage, well, let him try. Who knows, he might surprise you. Naruto smiled radiantly at the praise. Now, we really should get to introductions. I suppose Naruto already covered mine, and his own. Pinky. Ah. Sakura glanced at Sasuke, and blushed. I'm Haruno Sakura. My goal is to be a great kunoichi, and... She blushed even more. Well, Kakashi nodded, sighing. How about you, in the corner? I am Uchiha Sasuke. My goals, no, my ambitions, are the resurrection of my clan, and to kill a certain man. Well, nothing had changed there. Naruto sighed. He had a lot of work to do. Well, Kakashi, he's grown in an interesting way, Hokage-sama, the silver-haired Jonin replied. He wasn't nearly as annoying as I'd anticipated from the stories, but then, I suppose those were probably colored by his burden. Naruto is a most interesting boy, the Hokage agreed. Indeed, I hadn't really considered it until recently, until I caught him doing something he really shouldn't. The Hokage smiled, tapping his crystal ball. I've been keeping an eye out, sometimes. A few days ago, out of the blue, Naruto decided to pay a nighttime visit to the tower. He was quite sneaky about it, not even the Anbu spotted him. That's pretty good, for an academy student. The Hokage nodded. Of course, he usually wears bright orange. He must have learned to be quite good at hiding, if he can manage it with that eyesore of a suit he had. I've noticed he's stopped wearing it since he became a genin. I don't think it's a coincidence. The Hokage gestured at his scrolls. Here I've stored all the most powerful and dangerous scrolls in my own library, not even Naruto can get at them. If he can sneak in and out of the tower itself, though, I think he's earned his spoils. Ah, you'll make the protections on the scrolls progressively better. Kakashi guessed. I recall that being a Jonin-level assignment, though. Perhaps. But then, I think we might be underestimating Naruto's cunning, even now. Do you know which scrolls he took? Not more forbidden scrolls. After the first time. No, he got what he wanted from those, I think. He must have overheard someone about the contents of those. If there is anyone who can use the Kage Bunshin technique to its full potential, it has to be him. Keep an eye on that, will you? Regardless, this time he went straight for a specific type of scroll. Fuinjutsu. The sealing arts. Kakashi blinked, eyes widening. Don't tell me. The Hokage smiled. He's been borrowing one Namikaze Minato's notes. Nothing really dangerous, but definitely complex, enough to make me dizzy. If he's already trying to figure out those kind of techniques, who knows? Perhaps it does run in the family, after all. That would be interesting, wouldn't it? The Hokage shrugged. When Jiraiya returns to town, I'll ask him to test the boy. He's bound to be here for the Chunin exams in a few months. His eyes hardened as he stared at the Jonin sensei. You'll treat Naruto well, won't you, Kakashi? I know you have the last Uchiha on your team, too. No favoritism, as you say. Kakashi bowed, and left. Uzumaki Naruto, where have you been hiding your talent? The Hokage muttered to himself as he shook his head in amusement. Stealing from the Hokage tower, only you would be so bold. Well, you, and Jiraiya. Naruto lounged on his apartment's roof, his legs dangling down over the edge as he distractedly watched the clouds sail by in the sky, and considered his next course of action. Though a number of different plans were still ongoing, there had to be more that he could do right now. He'd be faced with Kakashi's bell test again, this morning. It was almost nostalgic, thinking back on the first time he'd done it and the repeat, a few years later, and how amateurish he'd really acted. Granted, he was hardly an elite Jonin right this moment, but he was no slouch either. It would be interesting to test out his stealth skills against one of the true elites, especially given that he wouldn't be wearing his best suit and tools for the job, and he wasn't nearly agile enough to really be a serious threat. Getting back in shape was, however, not his main concern. That would happen soon enough, with proper training. Going overboard right now would just destroy him. He wasn't developed enough to deal with it, so he focused his efforts elsewhere. Thankfully, there were no such limitations on focusing his chakra control, a far more important skill. As far as assassinations went, people really underestimated how very little strength was really needed to end a life. Man, this handwriting's like a medical ninja's with a bottle of sake down the hatch, Naruto muttered in exasperation as he stored away the Fuinjutsu scrolls he'd been deciphering. He couldn't very well leave them up here for anyone to find, after LL. He wasn't having much more luck with their contents, but at least he was slowly dissecting the scribbles until they matched legible text, which would probably be helpful. He'd really only gotten into the sealing arts after the Fourth Shinobi World War. He'd been interested in figuring out the Kyuubi's seal, not to mention all the other ones he'd come across, and with a relative period of peace in the foreseeable future, he'd decided to, for once, dedicate some time to actual studying. Sakura had been, unsurprisingly, amazed. Unfortunately, without Jiraiya to be a teacher, he didn't really have access to a master in the field, and he'd had to muddle along on his own. It didn't help that a lot of the village's records were destroyed in Nagato's attack. Thankfully, neither of those limitations were present, not anymore. Yo! Naruto looked up in surprise, dropping his storage scroll to the roof. Kakashi sat in a crouch on the edge of his roof, smiling cheerily behind his ever-present mask. Kakashi-sensei, I'm not too late, am I? Naruto asked, blinking. Had he been reminiscing and studying his scrolls for so long that he'd managed to miss his proper genin exam? That would be embarrassing. Don't worry, you still have a while yet. Kakashi stepped onto the roof, and stretched. I was just curious. Honestly, I saw you sitting up here, and wondered what you were up to. Not planning any more nasty pranks, are you? Naruto laughed. Well, I'm a shinobi now, right? I figured that I have some other things to do now, instead of entertaining the villagers. He withered under Kakashi's skeptical gaze. Fine. I ran out of paint, so I was thinking of waiting until I get some more. I should get some money from the missions, right? You'll have to pass the test first. You're aware, you didn't eat yet, right? Kakashi asked, smiling. He glanced around to the other roofs, and then turned back to his student, talking softly. Naruto, I was curious about that bingo book you had yesterday. Yes. Was there a particular reason you brought it with you to the introductions? Especially such an odd one, at that. If I didn't know any better. He glanced at Naruto sharply. I'd think you were trying to make a point. Naruto looked at his teacher nervously. What do you mean, sensei? I think you know what I mean. He smiled congenially, dropping down to the roof, then looked knowingly at Naruto. There's no crime in showing off, and I can understand your pride, but you should consider the consequences of your actions. You never know who might be watching. He smiled cheerily. So, I would keep that book of yours at home. Naruto wasn't terribly surprised that Kakashi had seen right through his facade. Bringing that bingo book to the meeting had been a calculated decision. He'd actually counted on Kakashi realizing what he was doing, laying some groundwork with his teammates. He was certainly not going to run into being a ninja like a complete idiot, this time. If getting along with him required matching the Uchiha's claim to an awesome family, well, that's what he'd do. A ninja uses all his tools, after all. I'll try to be careful, Naruto said after a while, frowning. I hadn't thought about spies. I suppose there's a chance that Iwa might try something if they ever figured out about the fourth, but I doubt they'd get this far into town. He sighed. Kakashi nodded, pausing for a moment. So, how long have you known about that? Naruto faltered. He couldn't very well admit to how he really knew. Kakashi seemed to take his silence as an answer in itself. Naruto finally shrugged. A while. The resemblance is a bit obvious, isn't it? I didn't really know until. He paused. Well, until a few weeks ago, honestly. He didn't mention how he'd found out. Kakashi would probably fill in the blanks himself. The Jonin raised an eyebrow. Does the Hokage know what you found out? We haven't spoken about it, Naruto said. I hoped he'd tell me himself, sometime. Then I wouldn't need to act so oblivious about it anymore. I thought maybe he'd do so when I became a genin, but I suppose I was mistaken. He glanced up. You won't tell him that I know, will you? Naruto. Come on, you're my sensei. Isn't there some sensei-student confidentiality or something? Kakashi rolled his eye. Fancy words, for an idiot. Anyway, the Hokage's not stupid, he probably knows already. He certainly has good reasons to keep it a secret, so he would probably want to talk to you about it. He tapped Naruto on the hip. Just keep it in here, unless you get permission to tell someone. Naruto nodded uncertainly. What about my team? I can't just lie to them, can I? Kakashi smiled. First, you'll have to pass my test, or you won't even be a team. After that, well, who knows? I'm sure we can figure something out. Thanks, Kakashi-sensei. Naruto smiled slightly, looking out over the village towards the Hokage monument. You know, maybe you could tell me about Dad, sometime. You were his student, after all. Kakashi nodded sagely. I will. Nearly 2 hours later, Naruto sauntered onto the training ground. Sasuke and Sakura were already there. The former was studiously ignoring the latter's enthusiastic attempts at gaining his attention, and neither paid any attention to his approach. Hey, guys. Sakura glanced up and nodded. Good morning. She looked over Naruto's shoulders and frowned. Have you seen Kakashi-sensei? I figured he'd be here early, since it's the first day. Naruto snorted loudly. Early. He shook his head mirthfully, glancing at Sasuke who leaned against a nearby tree disinterestedly. Even though he'd met his sensei just this morning, and it was definitely not the last such meeting, he figured, he was certain the man would drag out the test enormously, as always. If the stories are true, we'll probably be waiting for a few hours. What? Sakura exclaimed. Don't be silly, Naruto. He's a Jonin. He can't do something like that. I bet he'll just appear out of nowhere, real soon. I've seen them do that, you know. She looked Sasuke and smiled. I'm sure he's really strong, since he gets to teach Sasuke-kun. Oh, brother, Naruto sighed, glancing between the two others. Whatever, I guess I'll go find a good spot to wait, then. He walked over to one of the trees and walked straight up the side, hands in his pockets. The complete silence that fell over the clearing before he was even halfway up was quite telling, and an irrepressible grin made its way onto his face. Unfortunately, the calm wouldn't last. Naruto, how the heck are you doing that? Sakura exclaimed, staring and pointing at him. Even Sasuke paid attention, eyebrows raised as he noticed the seemingly impossible feat. Naruto stopped and turned to look at the two, managing a vaguely puzzled expression. What do you mean, Sakura-chan? You're like defying gravity, Sakura said, narrowing her eyes. I've seen Chunin do that, sometimes, walking up walls and such, but we never learned anything like that in the academy. Naruto smiled, scratching the back of his head. Ah, right, I sort of taught myself this one. It's not really hard, I'm sure you'll get it right away. You just have to concentrate chakra in your feet to stick to the bark, and then walk up. It took me a while to stop falling off, though. You taught yourself, Sakura repeated, perplexed. She smiled and balled her fist, staring at a nearby tree confidently. If the dead last can do it, then I'm sure it's a piece of cake. She walked over to the tree, concentrating briefly on gathering chakra. Don't overdo it, Sakura-chan. You still need energy for Kakashi-sensei's test, Naruto reminded her. He smiled though. Getting Sakura's self-confidence up was easier than he'd thought, though his total idiot reputation probably wouldn't last for very long. It was useful while it lasted. It helped that he'd picked an exercise that was perfect for her. Sakura put a foot on the tree, and then another. On her very first try, she slowly made her way up the tree, setting herself down on a branch about 15 feet off the ground. Sweat beaded on her brow, but she laughed victoriously. That was awesome. Sasuke glanced between his two teammates, both of whom were now in the trees, and shrugged. Pretty good, for the dead last and a weakling. Hey, don't be a prick, Uchiha, Naruto yelled, and he winced. Insulting Sasuke was almost a reflex. He'd been so used to it for such a long time. He quickly tried to salvage the situation. Ah, sorry, Sasuke. We're supposed to be a team, right? Sasuke shrugged, staring out over the training ground. It was a few minutes later that he stood up, staring contemplatively at the tree he was leaning against. Naruto had taken his own spot on one of the branches of his own tree, and looked on with interest. Finally, the Uchiha tried to walk up the tree, and slid right off. A little more chakra, Naruto commented. Otherwise you won't stick. Not too much, or you'll launch right off. I know, Sasuke muttered, trying again. Several attempts later, he still hadn't gotten beyond 2 or 3 steps, and stared in frustration at the tree. He sent a reproachful glare at Naruto and Sakura, but didn't comment. You just decided to learn this on your own. Sakura wondered after a while, turning to Naruto. You never paid attention in the academy. The academy's boring. Ninja skills are far more exciting. I saw some Jonin do all these cool tricks on the roof, so I decided I'd try and copy them. I've been using them to get around since forever. He grinned. I got a lot better with chakra, even if I didn't really know any techniques. I couldn't do the Bunshin until a week ago. Sasuke was still struggling to climb the trees, but he wasn't getting much higher than 4 or 5 steps. Naruto let him muddle on for a little longer, then decided to show a little mercy. You're doing pretty well, Sasuke. It took me 2 days to get as high as you're doing now. Maybe you should continue later, though. You might exhaust yourself. The Uchiha muttered something uncomplimentary, and then did something that Naruto hadn't expected he was even capable of. He swallowed his pride. What's the trick? Naruto paused. Well, practice, of course. Oh, I understand. Sakura exclaimed suddenly. This is a chakra control exercise, isn't it? We learned about those in the academy, and it said that control was much harder to train when you have lots of chakra, compared to if you have little. I don't have much, so I walked right up. She looked at Sasuke and smiled. It must mean that Sasuke-kun has a lot of chakra. Well, not that I would have doubted that. Sasuke nodded warily. It took him a moment, but then he sent a suspicious look at Naruto. You took 2 days, Well, it took me longer to get to the top all the time, Naruto explained. I didn't have anyone to tell me what to do, though. Silently, he cheered, knowing a little about their personalities really did help in getting along with his teammates, even this early. Sakura hadn't yelled at him once in the last 10 minutes. Sasuke returned to his tree, leaning against it once more. For once, Naruto realized, he actually kept an eye on his teammates, staring from under his fringe. Hey guys, good morning. You're late, Sakura screeched, pointing at the lazy Jonin and fuming. We've been here for hours, waiting for you to show up. Kakashi smiled. I had to see the Hokage about something. He immediately glanced at Naruto, still sitting on his branch. Along the way I remembered I'd forgotten to pick up some food, and then Yes, Naruto muttered in annoyance, striding down the tree leisurely. Let's get the test over with, shall we? The Jonin stared at his blonde student for a few long moments. The casual tree walking certainly hadn't evaded his attention. Sasuke strode over to join the others, scowling. He might not have yelled about the lateness, but he certainly didn't appreciate it. Right, Kakashi pulled a little clock from his vest, quickly setting the alarm. This will go off at noon. So, what do we have to do? Sakura asked. Kakashi smiled, pulling something else from his pockets, 2 little bells. Your task is to take these from me. Those who cannot get the bells by noon, get no lunch. He glanced at 3 tall tree stumps a little ways away, and nodded in their direction. There are only 2 bells, so one of you will end up tied to a stump, forced to watch the others eat in front of them, and they'll be sent to the academy. Sakura gulped. Naruto and Sasuke didn't react at all. You won't succeed, unless you come at me with intent to kill. Naruto smiled viciously. Are you sure, sensei? You'll be in danger. Granted, he hadn't taken any poisons along, or anything particularly dangerous, in general, but it was the thought that counted. I think you'll find that I'm a Jonin. I can take on a few genin. He smiled, attaching the bells to his belt and scooting back. Remember, you have until noon. Whoever doesn't have a bell loses. Begin. The clearing was empty in an instant. Naruto flung himself into the bushes and immediately darted across to the next, leaving a shadow clone behind. It wouldn't work for very long, but it might be sufficient to distract his teacher for a few moments. Making a quick hand sign, he used henge to turn his orange and black attire into a mottled green. Not the greatest camouflage out in the open, but it was better than nothing. Right. Plan of attack. He knew Kakashi's strategy for this little test, which allowed him to come up with some pretty good solutions. Usually you didn't have such insight into the enemy's movements. Conjuring 2 shadow clones, Naruto quickly climbed into the nearest tree while sending the 2 others off, making sure to tone his chakra down as much as possible, a pretty tough feat for a Jinchuriki. He smiled as he considered what the Jonin would say if he actually lost, this time around. Naruto dropped down next to Sakura, drawing a startled gasp from the pink-haired Kunoichi as she raised a kunai defensively. It took her a moment to calm down. It's just you. Wait, when did you change clothes? He put his finger to his lips, glancing around himself. Sakura-chan, we should find Sasuke, Naruto whispered. Kakashi must have gone after him first, otherwise he'd already be here. What do you mean? Sakura wondered aloud. The blonde grabbed her arm and in one movement dumped both of them into the bushes. Thankfully, Sakura was too shocked to retaliate and Naruto quickly released her. Silence, he said softly as Sakura prepared to scream. He drew 3 shuriken, glancing around the area carefully. He made sure to keep one hand on the ground at all times, remembering one of Kakashi's favored techniques all too well, digging underground. Sakura, you probably have the best chakra control out of all of us. Can you sense where Kakashi-sensei is? Sakura blinked uncertainly, frowning as she wiped the dust off her arms. I haven't learned anything like that, idiot. We went to the same academy, remember? Naruto sighed. He should have realized that he was dealing with this early Sakura again, who barely knew anything yet. Right, well, then we'll have to do it the old-fashioned way. When I say run, you should head north. I'll meet you along the way. We'll go to Sasuke together. From there. He gestured behind him. I'll make a diversion in the other direction. What did you mean, meet you there? You're already here. How's going the other way going to help? The clone only smiled. Don't question it. Go. Thankfully, she did. Jumping out of the bushes with as much stumbling and noise as he could manage, it didn't take long for Kakashi to find him. The one-eyed Jonin appeared in an instant, smiling cheerfully. Naruto raised a kunai before him, amused at how very similar this was to what he remembered from the first time around. You know, I thought you had this stealth thing figured out, but I guess you're just a bit dim. Kakashi said, gazing lazily at his new target. The shadow clone growled, pointing in outrage. You take that back, and you were doing so well, Kakashi said mournfully, rummaging through his bag. After a few moments, he retrieved a very familiar book. You can attack me now, if you wish. You won't hit me, you know. Fighting you was never my intention, Kakashi-sensei, he declared with a smile, stabbing himself with his kunai. Sakura was long gone. He'd done his job. He popped away in a puff of smoke. Naruto jerked upright as two clones popped, nearly simultaneously. Sakura was heading his way. Sasuke hadn't listened to a word the clone had to say, unfortunately, and it had popped itself in frustration. Stretching from his prolonged uncomfortable position up in the tree, the real Naruto quickly ran in Sakura's direction. He'd have to intercept her, at least. Hopefully Kakashi hadn't gotten to her, yet. While he was waiting to hear back from the clones he'd sent after his teammates, he'd made more, many more, and they were now spread all across the forest. Using henge to turn into twigs or logs or other unimpressive objects, they'd serve as decoys and surveillance. If necessary, the clones would make for a great diversion from his true position, as they resembled his real self quite a bit as far as chakra went, and if Kakashi popped any, the real version would immediately know where the Jonin was. Actually, abusing his shadow clone technique had been one of the first reliable assassination techniques he'd ever developed, back in his previous life. Barely any skill required. Sakura, Naruto said, stepping out from behind the trees. She looked shocked at his sudden appearance, but that could probably be attributed to his attire. He was actually blending in, at least a little. He idly wondered why he only ever saw Guy and Lee dress in something entirely green, even if an obnoxious shade, given that they lived right in the middle of a forest. He could only really imagine the Chunin flak jackets, and those were probably too bright to serve as camouflage. How did you do that? Sakura asked, her eyes wide. She glanced back where she came from. You were just there, and now. Later. We'll need to find Sasuke, now. The mention of her crush diverted Sakura's attention away from Naruto's sudden appearance. Explaining his shadow clones and how he'd managed to get that particular technique would take way too long. Come, he's northwest of us. Sakura quickly followed Naruto, trying to follow his movements. She didn't even question how he'd located their other team member. Taking extra care to avoid detection, Naruto darted from tree to tree, sticking to the shadows and avoided disturbing the leaves and branches around them. Sakura had to fend off quite a few of them as they whipped back and forth by her passage, and she grumbled in annoyance. Thankfully, Kakashi didn't appear, and they emerged from the copse of trees into the next clearing. Right next to Sasuke, buried up to his neck in the ground. Naruto winced as Sakura screeched, quickly walking over to Sasuke and frowning. Can you move at all? I don't need your help. Sasuke muttered, trying to look away. Naruto remembered this. It was just like Kakashi had trapped him the first time around. It figured, given that he'd gone off his own, just like then. He really needed to figure out a way to get rid of that attitude. Perhaps lending assistance would be a good step. I think I have something that might be helpful here. Hold on. Rummaging through a pile of small papers that he had stashed in his pockets, Naruto finally retrieved a rather crudely drawn, but very complex symbol imprinted on thick paper. This should work, I think. What's that? Sakura wondered, looking around nervously, though Kakashi seemed to keep his distance. Naruto suspected he was simply keeping an eye on them, for now. He placed his seal next to Sasuke's scowling head, feeding chakra into the intricate symbol until it shimmered with a soft blue glow. Sakura stepped back in surprise as it gave off a spark. Naruto laughed nervously. Don't worry, it's just fuinjutsu. It's the soft solid sealing technique. I finished it a few days ago. It's supposed to turn the earth to liquid around it, so we'll see if it works. He smirked as he gingerly tapped the ground and found that it gave way. It felt almost like quicksand, though the seals only affected a small area. Now, Sasuke, grab my hand. It took 2 pulls with all his strength until Naruto managed to drag Sasuke out. The ground hardened again almost immediately, the little seal he'd used sputtering as its chakra charge ran out, and it destabilized. That one was certainly not reusable, as it crumbled. Naruto frowned briefly as he watched it happen. He really needed to get some proper sealing paper again, but he'd need to get Jiraiya's help for that, or the third's. How did you of all people learn the sealing arts? Sasuke asked after a few moments, as he wiped the last of the dirt from his clothes. It's one of the most difficult ninja disciplines there is. Naruto didn't respond immediately, gazing up at the sun. Let's talk about that another time. We only have about half an hour left, if even that much, to complete the test. What are we going to do about the bells? He glanced between Sakura and Sasuke with an expression that he hoped didn't expose the cackling manipulator he felt like. I mean, Kakashi-sensei took down Sasuke, so he has to be too strong for any one of us on our own. Sasuke narrowed his eyes, leaning against a tree. You want to work together. There are only 2 bells. We'll decide who gets one afterwards, Naruto declared airily. If none of us get a bell, what's the point? Sasuke frowned, looking back to the burned-out seal. Dead last, how many of those do you have? You really should have hidden better, I'm afraid, Kakashi said jovially, as he popped upright behind her. Sakura jumped back in shock, grasping for one of her kunai, but it was too late. For a moment she looked confusedly around herself, then she slumped to the ground. Kakashi sighed and stretched his neck. So easily felled by a simple genjutsu, how unfortunate, Kakashi said softly, shaking his head. Honestly, he had to say, none of his students had really impressed him this year. Sasuke, as expected, had shown aptitude for taijutsu and high-powered fire jutsu. He was perhaps a little better than your average Uchiha was at his age, but there weren't many to compare him to, anymore. Naruto, well, he knew how to hide, that was true enough. Stealing from the Hokage did indicate at least some proficiency as far as that went, he supposed. Still, even with Naruto's shadow clone trick which allowed Sakura to escape, the 3 had gone their separate ways once more, and each of their individual attacks had been cut short without much of a hassle. Waiting for them to arrive for another go was, as it turned out, rather boring, and he quickly found himself engrossed in his book once more. It looked like this would be another fail year. Well, nobody would be surprised, at least. Sakura stirred, and Kakashi looked up. Was she actually fighting the genjutsu? It was about time. She'd been under for a few minutes, and it wasn't terribly complex. Unfortunately, aside from the brief twitches, nothing happened. How disappointing. Kakashi ducked suddenly, a foot crossing through where his head had just been. Sasuke landed heavily, but he turned on a dime, ready for another try. If his kick had connected, it could have done some serious damage, Kakashi realized. There was a reason that he was the rookie of the year. Well, it's about time you got back, the Jonin said airily, smiling. Sasuke got into a taijutsu stance, his arms straightened out before him, and he sneered. Kakashi obliged him by taking his own stance. Sasuke was good enough that he actually had to pay a little attention. Ready for another round, then. Last time was a fluke. Kakashi smirked. Oh, this was precious. Well, we'll see about that. Kakashi stepped aside in the blink of an eye. Naruto blundered past, almost toppling over his feet, though he managed to stop himself before he hit the ground. Twisting around, he moved to Sakura's side, frowning. Well, that made the complete set. Kakashi smiled, slipping his book back in his bag. I see that I have to pay attention. Attacking together, then. Remember that there are only 2 bells. Sasuke and Naruto nodded. Sakura worked herself to her feet, smiling devilishly. You'd better watch out, Kakashi-sensei, you're going down. The Uchiha stepped back from his 2 teammates, forming a hand sign, and Kakashi blanched the instant he recognized it. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. That wasn't possible. Naruto could know it. The Hokage has said something about that, the shadow clone technique, but only because of his incredible chakra reserves could he pull it off. Kakashi gaped in astonishment as the Uchiha did the same. Sasuke, not even you have the chakra capacity for something like that. You could die. He blinked as Naruto formed the same hand sign, and with a series of pops, he was now facing 7 students. 6 of them had identical manic grins. Wait, now. Kakashi only had enough time to duck and spin halfway before he was forced to block a vicious punch aimed directly at his face with the back of his hand. The hit came courtesy of Sakura. Of the 7 people he'd been facing, only she had been anything more than a clone, as she took a sharp hit in retaliation. It had been a distraction, and a successful one. Sasuke jumped out from behind Sakura and delivered a devastating dropkick that only barely missed his head, and Kakashi was forced to duck another, when Naruto tried to attack from behind. 8 more clones attempted to join the close combat, and the Jonin finally had enough. The fight was getting awfully messy. He flipped backwards over and away from the throng, landing barely 3 feet from where he started. Now we're talking. Let's see if you can keep that up. Naruto formed a hand seal. Fuinjutsu. Activate. The ground vanished. That's the only way Kakashi could describe it. From one moment to the next, the soil turned from rock solid to a soggy mud-like texture, and he sunk down to his waist before he even managed to get a grip. 2 flying kicks were headed directly towards him, and he couldn't pull off an earth move in such a short time. Not one that wouldn't maim his students, at least. As a last-ditch effort, he switched himself out via Kawarimi, appearing a few feet above his students' heads on a thick branch. A small log had taken his place, and took the beating. Well, that had certainly been creative. Sasuke and Sakura dusted themselves off as several of Naruto's clones vanished, as the real one muttered something unintelligible. Kakashi had to give it to him. Tricking him into a melee just to get him to a specific trapped spot on the battlefield, that was a pretty good plan for academy students. Using seals of all things to make a trap, now that was just ridiculous for that level. He didn't know many shinobi who even learned Fuinjutsu beyond explosive and storage applications, and certainly nothing quite this sophisticated before they were even genin. Minato-sensei, great as he'd become, hadn't really started specializing until well into Chunin or Jonin rank. Mission complete, Naruto exclaimed as he looked up, smiling widely. Kakashi's glanced down at his belt in surprise, and found the 2 little bells that had been safely kept there were missing. Judging from the frayed edges on what remained of the cord, they had been ripped right off. When had they managed that? Thinking about who and when, he heard his alarm going off in the distance. It was noon. The test was over, and he'd lost the bells. They'd done it. Well, I must admit, this is a surprise, Kakashi muttered soberly as he dropped down from his branch and landed beside Sasuke. You know that nobody's ever managed to take the bells before. Touch them, sure, but you're the first to actually steal them away. You should feel proud. That was such an awesome plan, Sasuke-kun. Sakura exclaimed, giggling. It worked perfectly. Sasuke shrugged, glancing at Naruto, who was beaming like the sun. He wasn't faking it either, given that beating Kakashi, even at a rather silly game like this, was quite the accomplishment. So, where are the bells? The Jonin in question wondered. You did keep them, right? Ah, I forgot, Naruto exclaimed, kicking the ground a few times. About 10 seconds passed before there was a response, as a hand burst from the earth, quickly followed by a second one. Sakura stepped back with a disturbed frown as a half-dead shadow clone dragged itself out onto dry land from a pit of liquefied earth, breathing harshly. The seal paper on the front of his jacket sizzled and sputtered out, and the clone sighed in relief. In one hand he held a long stalk of reed, the other had the bells. The real Naruto rubbed the back of his head and tried to look bashful. Sorry about that, clone. The clone scowled, waving his makeshift breathing tube around. Next time, do this yourself, boss. Do you have any idea how hard using this thing is with weak lungs? I feel like I've been running for hours on end. You're lucky I even had the presence of mind to snatch the bells. Don't whine, the real Naruto murmured, grabbing the bells and winking. I don't want to deal with all that sand up my nose, you know. Yek, that's why I have you clones. The fake Naruto sighed. I'm you idiot. You'll remember that anyway. Naruto ignored the annoyed replica, presenting the spoils of victory to the others. Well, here they are, then. Hope you don't mind that technically it was a shadow clone that got them, Kakashi-sensei. He sent a foul look to his other self, who stuck out his tongue. No, that's all right. Honestly, Naruto felt like dancing. It had taken ages to trick Kakashi, the first time around, and it didn't help that Kakashi got progressively better over those years, too. It had been a vicious cycle, but now he'd broken it. Of course, that probably meant that training would be twice as hard. So, you have the bells, now. Kakashi raised an eyebrow. Which of you three's going back to the academy, then? He turned to look at each in turn, ultimately gazing straight at Sakura. Well, let's hear your take. She hesitated, glancing between Sasuke and Naruto. For a moment her gaze lingered on the latter, and she looked decidedly troubled. Finally she looked down. I suppose it would have to be me, then. I did the least out of all of us. That's not true, Sakura-chan. Naruto declared heatedly, turning to her. You put the seals on the ground. When you acted like you fainted, you were the key to the whole plan. If anyone shouldn't go on, it should be me. All I did was make a lot of clones, and I don't think any of them hit anything. Sasuke sighed, shaking his head. You make the seal, too. It worked. Naruto gaped for a moment. Had the Uchiha just said something positive about him? It seemed Kakashi was similarly surprised, glancing between his three students. Then, he relaxed, smiling widely. Well, you pass. What? Sakura exclaimed, while Sasuke just sniffed, though a thin smile made it onto his face too. The test was never about getting the bells, Naruto observed, recalling with amusement the first time they'd had this conversation. For one, he'd been a lot hungrier at this time. Real missions aren't usually solo. They're group missions, for a full team, which never has just 2 members. Getting 2 bells was a way of splitting us up, nothing more. You are correct, Kakashi said. In the ninja world, those who break the rules are trash, that's true, but those who abandon their comrades are worse than trash. He tapped Naruto on the head and smirked. You actually remembered the question that your sensei put forward, right? Think before you act, and you'll go far. Naruto nodded solemnly, then grinned. Who wants to get some ramen to celebrate? Sasuke sighed. Sakura just rolled her eyes. Still they didn't say no. Naruto smirked. Maybe he should have tried being awesome the first time around. Yes. He'd actually managed to take what had originally been a reluctant teaming up which involved being tied to a stump and denied food, and turned it into a genuine group victory. Take that, Destiny. Kakashi put his hands in his pockets, nodding proudly. You will make an excellent team. It'll take time, but I think we'll get you to the top. Sensei. Kakashi blinked, glancing at Sakura in confusion. Yes. What is it? I was just thinking about something you said. How did you know the question that Iruka-sensei put to us? She frowned. That was way before you arrived, wasn't it? Kakashi laughed nervously. The road of life happened to pass by your classroom. Sensei. Hey, old man, Naruto said as he waved lazily, passing by Konohamaru with barely a glance. The little boy pouted at being ignored but didn't comment, just staring as the new arrival stopped in front of his grandfather's desk with narrowed eyes. I'm glad to see you, Naruto. Just a moment, the Hokage said, glancing at the other people in the room in turn. Ebisu, you can take care of things for a little while, right? Oh, of course, Hokage-sama. The baffled Jonin said, bowing slightly as he took Konohamaru along. A gesture of the third later, the two Anbu that were waiting at the door vanished as well. Naruto sighed and shook his head, sinking into the comfortable chair he'd almost forgotten. Tsunade had thrown it out. The Hokage just looked at him for a while, and Naruto couldn't help but fidget a little. That serious look wasn't one he saw too often on the third, and it had been many years since they'd really been in the same room, even if the old man didn't know as much. I assume you have some idea of why I requested your presence. I was visited by your Jonin-sensei, this morning. The old man walked over to the window, staring outside dispassionately. He had some interesting things to tell me. Can you guess what those were? Well, this wasn't much of a surprise. We spoke, before the test. I'm sure it was about that. True. The Hokage turned and smiled slightly. He told me you had discovered a secret of the village. You know about your father, about Minato. Naruto shrugged. Kakashi-sensei already warned me that I shouldn't tell people, but it's hard. I'm sure you can understand, right? He pointed behind him. I mean, look at Konohamaru. He's always shouting that he's family of yours. I see your point, the third said, picking up a photograph from the side table that held his crystal ball. A very familiar photograph. Tsunade had given him that same one, many years ago, a photo of the fourth. The original reason that I made your parentage a secret, even from yourself, related to your parents' fame. There are many who would like to make a posthumous attack on the fourth, and who better to attack than his son, then. Keeping your identity a secret has greatly reduced the danger you were in, over the years. I chose to keep you in the dark, as well, after a long debate with myself on the topic. I admit that I feared you would ruin the secrecy in a moment of carelessness. He looked at the silent, attentive Naruto with a frown. You understand, right? Of course, Hokage-sama. The third seemed briefly surprised. You seem oddly respectful, today. You're calling me by my title, now. Well, I'm a shinobi, since today, Naruto said evasively. I need to show respect, right? Otherwise I'll just get in trouble with Kakashi-sensei. The Hokage didn't respond to that, putting the photo back where it came from, and turning to the new genin. There's more that I wanted to mention, of course. Kakashi reported that you showed some remarkable skills in your exam. Kage Bunshin, some taijutsu well above academy level, and a seal that he hadn't seen before, and suspected was of your own design. These are not skills you just come by from scratch. I think I know how you learned a few of them, though, he smiled knowingly. Will you confess, or should I tell you? Crap. Naruto froze, thinking back to everything he'd done over the last days. Where had he slipped up? The Hokage definitely couldn't know about Mizuki or Gato. He wouldn't be smiling, then. He couldn't know about the letters, either, since he'd sent those days ago, and they shouldn't make terribly much sense to any interceptors anyway. That left his visits to the tower. He'd been spotted, for the first time in ages. Damn, he really was worse than he was used to, then. Naruto started nervously, eyes wide. He supposed there was no changing it. Now, if he'd get in trouble for his forays, he'd have to figure out alternative ways to achieve his goals. I suppose, I'm not in trouble, am I? That depends on what you did, the Hokage said neutrally. There was no smile left now, and a shiver ran down his back as Naruto looked away. Damn, he'd been sneaking in and out of places for years, stealing when required, and it was the old man was the first to actually make him regret it, even a little. Alright, then, I admit, I took scrolls from the tower. The thunderous expression on the Hokage's face did nothing to settle his worries, and Naruto wondered for a moment if he'd misjudged him, after all. The Hokage stepped forward, and for a brief second it seemed as if the old man was going to hit him, then his hand came down and ruffled through the blonde's hair. The Hokage's lips twitched, and he shook his head mirthfully, as the oppressive atmosphere vanished. Oh, Naruto, what are we going to do with you? You're not mad. Let me tell you a story, Naruto. The third sat back in his chair, and took up his pipe. Long ago, there was a genin of Konoha, who had quite a bit of interesting in the sealing arts. He'd been on his team for only a year or two, but he always butted heads with one of his teammates, so he decided he would impress them. Of course, in his infinite wisdom, he believed that his simple seals were not enough. The really interesting ones had to be complex, he reasoned. So, he decided that he would get a scroll with a high-ranked seal. Naruto blinked. He didn't know this one, which was quite a surprise. Sneaking into the tower was the easy part. He managed to get in, but the window closed behind him due to the wind, and he couldn't open it again without making noise. Thus, he was forced to find another way out. Ever the opportunist, he took the most promising scrolls he could and walked right out of the front gate. What? How could that happen? Naruto exclaimed, enthralled. Where were the guards? The Hokage and his guards kept a close eye on the boy, of course. They'd been following him ever since the window slammed closed. Instead of arresting the thief, they were interested what he would do with the scrolls, whether he was going to sell them to some other nation or pass them on to someone else, perhaps. Instead, they discovered, the genin was learning from them. A few days later the scrolls were returned to the tower. The boy never even realized that he'd been discovered, and put back the scrolls when he was done with them. So, Naruto said, slowly, "You're not mad, because I'm like that genin. Because I put the forbidden scroll back after I'd finished. Well, I must admit that if you'd just run in there and took it from under my nose, I'd have acted rather differently." The Hokage said, and Naruto smirked. He knew exactly what would have happened, after all. Fortunately, you returned the scroll before anyone noticed it was missing. I spotted you when you returned it, though, and decided to keep silent. The whole thing made me rather nostalgic. So, what gave me away? Naruto leaned forward, frowning. I was suppressing my chakra, and I was wearing the proper clothing. I'm pretty sure I didn't make any noise, since the Anbu didn't show up. I admit, your infiltration was rather professional, the Hokage said. Very good for an academy student. I'm sure there are some jonin that would have trouble matching your performance. Still, you shouldn't underestimate a Kage. We are considered the strongest of a village, after all. Yes, but where did I screw up? Something must have tipped you off. The Hokage smiled slightly. Well, if I told you, you wouldn't have the chance to find the flaw yourself. Perhaps your sensei would be willing to help you out. I must say, I'd never really pegged you for the stealthy type, given the kind of clothes you're inclined to wear. Orange is the perfect color for stealth, Naruto said boisterously. He recalled what Sakura had said in another life, the first time she'd fallen for his stealthy approach. If you can stalk someone in a bright orange jumpsuit, you can do it in anything. Realizing how that sounded, he smiled nervously. Just on missions, of course. A strange sense in fashion and apparently a stalker. You have more in common with the genin in my story than you probably realize. The Hokage smiled, stepping back to his chair and sighing in relief. Naruto narrowed his eyes in contemplation. Who was it? Who was that genin you spoke about? His name's Jiraiya. You might have heard of him. Pervy sage, Naruto blurted. Well, that explained why he'd never heard that story, then. The white-haired lecher probably didn't even know, or he was ashamed he'd been caught like that. At the Hokage's sharp look after his exclamation, Naruto raised his hands in surrender. That's just what I heard a few chunin call him, I swear. He's the white-haired guy who is away so often and sometimes goes to the women's bathhouses, right? Probably. The third rubbed his temples wearily. Naruto, I understand that you want to learn some obscure skills, and I even have an inkling as to why, but you will need a teacher for something like that. Taking scrolls on fuinjutsu from the tower won't be enough. Experimenting on seals that you don't really know anything about can be very dangerous. I am careful, Naruto exclaimed, affronted. I have no doubt you are, but you are only a genin. In 2 weeks' time, at my request, Jiraiya will be returning to Konoha. He can serve as your teacher in fuinjutsu, if that is truly a field you have chosen to pursue. I'll have to find a way to persuade him, but I'm sure it's doable. Naruto practically cheered, though he knew he shouldn't let on that he knew the Sannin too much. In this time, they'd never actually met, after all. It'd be interesting to have him as a teacher again, Naruto thought. Though, he'd have to put up with his antics again. Another question occurred to him, then. Old man, how can he be my teacher, when Kakashi-sensei already is? Jiraiya will probably only instruct you in the evenings, or other periods where you are free from your duties, the third said. You're still a genin, after all, you'll have to do that training on top of your usual missions and exercises. Ah, man, Naruto pouted, standing up. Well, I suppose I'll go prepare for tomorrow, then. We're going to do D-class missions. I can barely wait, he sighed. I bet it'll be something lame, like painting a fence or catching a cat. He waved lazily as he headed for the door. I guess I'll hear about it when Jiraiya arrives in town. Later, Gramps, Naruto, the Hokage said softly, and the genin looked back. If you plan on taking any more scrolls, don't get arrested. The punishment for theft is more aggravating than painting fences, I assure you. Naruto laughed. They'll never catch me. Welcome home, boss. Naruto sighed, sinking down on his bed. How far did you get? About halfway. We've got time, don't we? He put down the scroll he'd been reading, putting aside his transcribed copy. That one was actually intelligible. I figure it'll take us about 3 days to go through them all, even with 3 clones on the job. Speed it up a little, will you? I just came back from the old man, and he's a hell of a lot more attentive than I figured. Naruto rubbed his eyes and yawned. Caught on my very first attempt at nicking something from the tower. Pathetic. Really should have expected it. You know, we had like 25 more years of experience on the old body, and didn't have to contend with having to fend it off anymore. The clone sat back at his small desk and frowned. You know, talking to myself like this is becoming a bad habit. Whatever. Thinking back to his old skills, actual, badass skills, he felt a pang of loss. Going back in time, however useful and potentially world-changing it was, had some bad sides. As it turned out, having 2 identical people in the world at the same time just wasn't possible for long periods. He had to deal with his genin body once again, with all the annoyances that came with it. Not the least of those was the Kyuubi. He'd lived with either control of its chakra or its total absence for so many years, it was strange even thinking of himself as a Jinchuriki again. That was another thing that he'd changed, in this time, even if he didn't originally intend it. By taking out Mizuki before the scroll incident occurred, he'd prevented himself from being told about his status. Although the Hokage knew that he was aware of his parentage, he hadn't said a word about being a Jinchuriki, about being the Kyuubi's container. There was a good chance that particular genie remained in the bottle, for now. Getting up, Naruto wandered over to his plants and quickly gave a few of them a little more water, as their leaves looked a little droopy. 2 of the little cacti seemed to be doing great, even so very far from Suna. He'd have to keep an eye on them. It was unfortunate that his original self didn't keep any particularly useful plants. He'd had to gather new samples from all across Konoha, and it would take weeks before the first proper poisons could be derived from what little he had so far. Getting a mission to Kumo or Kiri was really what he needed. There were countless rare plants there that he'd love to try his hand at, and sending a few dozen clones to harvest was no problem for him. The coming weeks were in flux. It really depended on how much he'd changed things, what he'd end up doing. It was possible that Kabuto would finally be an open target, and he would definitely take advantage of that. He was already working on dealing with Orochimaru, though it was unlikely that he'd be able to finish him off by himself. Still, there were plenty of badass shinobi around to point in his direction, and this time nobody would have to die. There was even a slim chance he could get in contact with a certain ninja well before they ever became a problem in the first place. As for Akatsuki, well, that was a more difficult problem, given how much of a mess taking care of them had been the first time. Aside from the obvious issue of avoiding their interest until he was strong again, right now, they'd take the Kyuubi in an instant. He also needed to make sure that their avenues of attack on some of the other Jinchuriki were cut off early. He couldn't manage that on his own either, especially since half of them were rather antisocial, so he actually did need allies. Toby hadn't even stepped to the forefront yet, at this time, and Pain was not yet ready to assault Konoha as he'd done before, so it wasn't an immediate concern. He had time, not a lot, but at the very least some, and he'd abuse it. Getting back in shape and building up his skill in sealing would have to be his priorities right now. If he wanted to mean anything to the other Jinchuriki, especially Gaara, he'd have to get a hell of a lot better in a short time. Beating Toby without inciting another bloody war would probably require him to surpass his father's skill, and his mother's knowledge. Rather a hefty challenge, even on the best of days. "Yo, boss, you've got mail." Naruto looked up, blinking, as his clone gestured at the window. Naruto didn't know what he was looking at first. There was a letter there, brown and somewhat rumpled, true. Sprinkled around it was a thick layer of dirt, even covering the paper itself, partially. Who'd sent him an envelope of dirt? His heart raced as he imagined for a moment it came from Gaara. Gingerly removing the letter without spreading the dust across his bedroom, Naruto was suddenly struck by the way it glittered. It wasn't like usual dirt, instead it was. He wrote back, Naruto said, eyes wide. He actually wrote back. Holy crap. He held up a handful of the dirt, letting it spill through his fingers. It's gold dust. Did he deliver it himself? Can he actually control this from such a huge distance? He can't know who I am. I never said. So did he somehow transport the response to the same place I sent it from? Amazing. He quickly scanned the letter, brushing the last of the gold dust onto his windowsill. Maybe he could get a pretty penny for it, after all. The missive wasn't long, and rather unfriendly, but it was a lot more than he had honestly expected. It was also rather terrifying, given what he'd read about the man who wrote it. The man didn't know who he was, just the pseudonym, and that he was from Konoha, but that was quite enough. The fourth cage wanted to meet him. Making his way across the roofs of Konoha at considerable speed, Naruto thought about his new objectives with this upset. Receiving a letter from the cage was crazy. He'd expected an instant rejection or no response at all. He figured he had to try, and evidently it had paid off. He'd have to take advantage of this potential boon quickly, but telling the truth was right out. Aside from wanting to avoid the question of how he'd managed this feat, interrogators were rather good at extracting information and the cage would doubtlessly take advantage of it. The man's arrogance, after all, was practically legendary. Still, there was secondary reasons to pursue this. One advantage of a detour to Suna was that he could meet Gaara, although it was unlikely that he'd be quite sane this point, meeting a fellow Jinchuriki might help him, a little. For another, he could consider paying a visit to the local Fuinjutsu storage. He smiled at that thought. Although he'd seen some of Suna's scrolls last time around, when Gaara was the cage, he'd never gotten into the really good stuff. He still wasn't sure if it had been out of respect or if he'd just been terrified Gaara would find out. If he was going to pull that off at all, he'd need to train. He'd need some way of getting the hell out of the way if the cage tried anything, which was a tall order as is, and he'd also need to figure out a way to keep himself visible back home, as well. He couldn't just leave Konoha behind and hoped his team and Hokage to keep a blind eye. Kage Bunshin, he exclaimed, and 6 clones popped into being. Naruto turned them and took each of them in. I need an alibi, and I can't let anyone find out. The coming days should only contain D-class missions, so this shouldn't be too hard, but I won't be around to get you guys new chakra. He reached into his jacket and smirked. Luckily, I still knew how to make this. That's a summoning scroll, one of the clones said, then widened his eyes. Oh, right, we used those to get more nature chakra, for Sage Mode. Haven't used those in forever, though. They were only necessary when Kyuubi was still around. This one can't really keep nature chakra, but it should suffice for regular shadow clones, Naruto reminded. He grimaced, then, I should make more, given that I've got the fox back. Perhaps the toads will notice those seals, but I doubt it. I'm pretty sure I've dissected them down to the basics. I'll give you a good stack of the things that already contain prepared shadow clone. You need to fill them in real quick on what's going on, but they should persist long enough that I'll make it back before they run out. Just be careful you don't pop too many. All right, boss, the first clone said, saluting. We'll do the all-important job of hunting cats and painting fences. He snickered. I'll probably prank the Uchiha bastard too, hope you don't mind. Naruto rolled his eyes, handing over the seals and frowning. Keep yourselves out of too much suspicion. No stealing scrolls until I get back, and avoid getting Kakashi-sensei interested. I will be here to switch out you for a few more days until I leave, but then you're on your own. As he left the group behind, Naruto tried to ignore the worry that crept up on him. Naruto, where have you been? Sakura asked, fuming. You were supposed to be here 15 minutes ago. The blonde walked over and glanced around. Kakashi-sensei's not even with you yet, or Sasuke, for that matter. He rolled his eyes. Lighten up, Sakura-chan. Sakura scowled. That doesn't mean you have to be late too, you know. Naruto shrugged, slumping down against the bridge and retrieving a little notepad from his pocket. The paper was orange, of course, and Sakura groaned. She'd hoped that the black clothing he'd worn at the Genin exam would stick around, but they had been quickly ditched for the current attire. Unfortunately, even this new outfit still had a lot of the unsightly orange that he'd been wearing for years, which just got on her nerves. Naruto retrieved a pencil and immediately started sketching, muttering under his breath. It took a few minutes, but finally Sakura's curiosity got the better of her. What are you doing now? Naruto glanced up, blinking. Oh, you mean this? I'm working on a new fuinjutsu technique, and I was just sketching some ideas for the seal. Maybe I can show you the finished project in a few days. I don't think it's going to be a very complex one. It'll take days, Sakura asked, blinking. Well, I'm designing them, not just making them, Naruto pointed out helpfully. The one I used yesterday, the soft solid one, was my own design after all. I'm thinking of making a couple nice ones and going to the patent office with them. I'm no expert, but I think I could make a bit of money with that, so I can fix up my apartment. How did you even get started with this? Sakura wondered, trying to get a glance at the notes. I've vaguely heard of the subject, but the academy certainly had nothing about it in the library. She frowned. In fact, I think Iruka explicitly mentioned it was one of the most difficult fields of study that existed, and most ninja know no more than explosive tags. Yes, well, that's what they say, Naruto answered idly. Here, I can show you a few of the basics, as I know them. You kind of have to get a feel for them, but you're smart. He smiled as he retrieved a small stack of seals from his pocket. These are the same as yesterday. Sakura picked up one of the seals and studied it. It was relatively simple overall, though she had no idea what any of the bits and pieces meant. The symbol was circular in shape with sequences of unintelligible symbols making up the circumference. It also had 2 spokes, one crossing north to south, the second from the center down to the southwest. Both were fairly straight lines with symbols seemingly drawn right on top of them. The whole thing made her think of a clock. 3 larger squiggles marked the end of each of the 3 lines where they touched the edge, each different in shape. Naruto tapped the side of the tag. The circle design is pretty commonly used. It's basically for stability, and it's one of only a few ways to make something like a temporary seal that you can actually trigger at will. This one's technically not a numbered seal since it's not complex enough to require it, but it would be a 2-element seal, if I did. He frowned. I tend to avoid odd-numbered seals myself, call it superstition. Anyway, there's other shapes for permanent seals, but as you can understand, they're not used that often, given the risks involved. You can make a permanent seal with only the circular element, but you need to be pretty good. You actually know what you're talking about, don't you? Sakura said, eyebrow raised. Imagine the day when the dead last is lecturing me. Naruto shook his head and smiled as he tapped the edge at the north. This big symbol at the top represents the earth element that's involved. Basically it transforms chakra into another nature, thereby allowing the seal to affect the soil. Seals aren't always used like that, but it's definitely useful in this one. Chakra. Nature. Sakura wondered. Naruto didn't answer her, but he smiled slightly at the question. He pointed to the south element next, to another symbol. Here, at the other pole, I placed the representation of water, since that's what I wanted the soil to act like. It's smaller than the north one since it's the secondary rather than primary focus, but it works well enough, and it's probably the second most stable bond in the whole thing. He hesitated. I think talking about chakra bonds goes a bit far, for now. Well, there's the third shape over there. This could really have gone in multiple directions, but I picked the one that was least volatile overall, as it's all about instability rather than stability, and I don't want to make it explode. A little less effect, but that's the cost of safety. Sakura blinked. You know a lot about this. Well, I do want to be awesome, so I have to, right? Naruto rubbed the back of his head in embarrassment. The whole complex generates the Doden chakra, that is, earth, that's already unstable as it flows through the soil, after which it turns it into sweetened chakra, or water. What you end up with is really unstable ground. He smirked proudly. It has some bugs, but it's already good enough to allow a properly prepared ninja to dig underground and hide there, without even having the Doden chakra nature. Chakra nature, you already said that just now. I think Iruka-sensei mentioned it, Sakura recalled with a frown. She looked at the seal in contemplation. What's this supposed to say, anyway? It looks like a bunch of scribbles to me. Naruto rolled his eyes. Sakura, the description I just gave was pretty much as elementary as I could put it. I really don't want to get into the script used or the kind of interactions you have to remember. This seal's pretty simple, and I've already found 2 in scrolls from the library that are using some of the same methods as I am. I know I'm in the right direction. I know what I'm doing. So it seems, Kakashi said. Sakura glanced up in surprise, though Naruto didn't even flinch. Right above them, holding his little book, sat their sensei. Sounds pretty good, Naruto. I might try out that seal of yours, later. Maybe I can let you know what you can improve. Sure, sensei, Naruto replied, getting up. Hey, Sasuke, ready to come down? Sasuke flipped to the ground from the branch he'd be sitting on, and landed softly, his hands in his pockets. Sakura shook her head in confusion. You were all here already. Nah, Sasuke arrived about 5 minutes ago, Naruto offered. He just didn't say anything, and he can be pretty quiet. Kakashi-sensei's been around since before I arrived, probably reading that book of his. Sakura didn't miss the surprised look from their sensei as he too jumped down to the ground and stashed his literature in one of his pockets. You managed to keep an eye out while making notes and talking, Naruto. It was easy enough. You weren't actually trying really hard to keep hidden. He got up, waving his notebook. When I finish this seal, I think you'll want to look at it, sensei. It's supposed to enhance the lightning element, so combining it with someone who has that nature would probably be awesome. It should work well with your assassination techniques, too. Kakashi smiled. Well, until your other teacher gets in town, I guess I'll offer my services. Now, though, we have to do something else. He turned to the other two genin. Since we're all here now, and not that late, why are you so early, anyway? Naruto cut him off, frowning. Early? He's half an hour later, dimwit. Sakura shook her head in a huff. Honestly. Right. That's what I said, early. Naruto blinked at the silver-haired Jonin. You're legendary for being at least 2 hours tardy for practically everything, so what gives? Did you lose a bet with someone over our passing the exam, or something? Kakashi shrugged, looking pointedly at the blonde for a moment. I have some obligations this afternoon, so we'll have to make sure to have our task done before I leave. Now, we'll be starting with D-class missions like all genin teams. I managed to get a nice and easy one to start you off with, so we should get right to it. What's this? Nice and easy mission? Sakura wondered. Cleaning the Hokage monument, Kakashi answered, sighing. Someone's seen fit to paint it with bright colors, and the civilians want it back to normal again. Damn it, Naruto, Sakura called, smacking him over the head. Wearing a henge that made him look like a rather spindly ninja of unclear rank, though certainly a chunin to avoid obvious questions, Naruto sprang from tree to tree on his way southwest. He'd spent quite a bit longer on his preparations than he'd anticipated, working to train himself in at least using some of his ninjutsu again, even if not at full power. 11 days he'd lost, but that was all right, since he had plenty of time yet before the invasion that happened last time. The cage certainly wouldn't be expecting him to appear quickly. He'd set no specific date or time on his letter, after all. 11 days, plus at least 2 or 3 to get to Suna, and then the way back. He was spending too much time on this, when he could be doing other things. Well, at least it was important. The forest would only stretch partway to Suna, and trekking through the desert really wasn't something he looked forward to, but he'd deal with it. He'd done it before, and at least he'd have some time to get some stamina training in. Getting out of Konoha had been annoyingly easy. The city wasn't on high alert, so most of the safeguards were lax at best, and Naruto knew them intimately as he'd participated in getting them back to normal, after the war. On the other side of the wall he relaxed a little. Even if he was detected, here, he wouldn't instantly be pegged as a deserter. Naruto realized in some annoyance that he probably counted as such. Now, meeting with a foreign cage without permission wasn't really something you got easily forgiven for. He'd used a bland pseudonym in his letter. Doubtlessly the only reason that the cage had even responded was that he'd mentioned several things not generally known by the public, regarding both his history and several secret projects Gaara had uncovered and stopped, in the first few years of his reign. His phrasing has been ambiguous, but someone with the kind of knowledge that the cage had would doubtlessly recognize it immediately. It got him invited, but it did raise a disturbing possibility. The cage might simply want him out of the way, permanently. It was lucky, he figured, that he'd sent the letter from his apartment, fairly central in the city, rather than somewhere more obscure, or he'd have missed the response entirely, since he lived above what was presently essentially an abandoned building only occasionally hired out for temporary stays. He could be anyone. That was good. Suna. The last time around, it wasn't until Gaara became cage that he really got to know much of anything about the place, so his knowledge of this particular time was, at best, spotty. The history books were inaccurate about the capabilities of the various shinobi forces between the Third and Fourth Shinobi World Wars, especially since a large amount of records was destroyed in the latter conflict. Still, he'd read up on the people. He knew some of what to expect. There were some people that even this nation respected. He'd put up the strongest henge he could. He certainly had the chakra to pull off a pretty impressive one, after all, and turned into one of the only people he knew how to imitate, and whose mere presence would ensure that the cage didn't try anything too crazy. His reputation preceded him, after all. Hope you forgive me for this one, sensei. Naruto's clone yawned as he wiped the last of his paint off the fourth's giant stone nose, and moved to his eyes. There was perhaps a certain irony in him being assigned to take care of cleaning his own father's part of the Hokage monument. He looked wistfully at the rest of the cliff. There, sometime in the future, would have been Granny Tsunade's face, Kakashi's face, mask and all. And finally Konohamaru's face, all grown up, though it hadn't yet been carved when he left. The Fifth Shinobi World War was just gearing up at the time, and he himself had been deep behind enemy lines, so he hadn't had the opportunity to stop by the village. Not before this opportunity had come along. Sitting down on the wooden platform that had been lowered from the top of the monument to allow for easy cleaning, Naruto thought about the past. He supposed it was the future, now. The first thing that struck him as strange, really, that he couldn't mesh the current Kakashi, disinterested, porn-reading, perpetually late, with the future one, who hadn't changed all that much. Perhaps it was the Hokage robes that he'd worn that did it, or the starkly serious moods that had become more common since he took up the hat. Naruto admitted that he'd been a little jealous when the sixth Hokage was announced, but Kakashi was the obvious choice, having already been in the running for fifth as well. He himself had been rather on the young side, and had understood the hesitance, even if he had gained considerable admiration for his involvement in the fight against Madara and Akatsuki. Konohamaru's election, that had been different. Naruto himself had been in the running for seventh Hokage. Kakashi was getting tired of his role after quite a few years in the seat, and finally some of the new promising shinobi were getting to appropriate ages, so he'd decided to pass on the title. The silver-haired Hokage, at the time, had been dispassionate about his reasoning for electing Konohamaru instead of him. Naruto admitted, he'd felt a little betrayed, but he had explained himself, later. Naruto, he'd argued vehemently, was too valuable to stick behind a desk. He was still one of the Leaf's strongest shinobi, and feared internationally since the Fourth Shinobi World War. Perhaps after hostilities were over, and the Fifth War was at an end, he could become Hokage, much like his father, but right now he was needed. His appearance on the front lines had done wonders for maintaining Konoha's security, as few were willing to take on the Yellow Flash's son. That secret had been publicly revealed over a decade earlier. Naruto had to admit that he couldn't have been present at more than half the conflicts that Konoha got involved with, if he also needed to be around the village all the time. Kakashi had probably been right, as far as where his best place was. Konohamaru, of course, had promised that he could be the eighth Hokage, in time, though that wouldn't be coming true. Perhaps things would be different, now. Perhaps he could be the one to appoint Konohamaru as his successor, now. Perhaps he'd take the seat after the old man, if he could prevent his death. Fifth Hokage Naruto, Jinchuriki protector of the Leaf, right next to his father on the monument. Yeah, that sounded good. Unlike his young years, which he'd now reclaimed, Naruto had ended up being a specialist in assassination and infiltration missions, even before Kakashi's belief that he was at that time what he himself had been. One of Konoha's shining beacons, who kept everyone else from doing stupid things, and who showed the strength of the village to the outside world. It was unfortunate that peace had not persisted as it had for a few years after the war, but the shinobi world, it seemed, was not yet ready for change. Had Nagato been right, after all? The exact moment he'd decided that if war couldn't be stopped by brute force, it might be via traditional shinobi values, he wasn't sure. Perhaps it had been the result of reading many a book on the philosophy of war, when he'd finally gotten around to slowing down a little. He'd shifted his focus from being a loud ninjutsu spammer towards a style that involved stealth, careful planning and efficiency. He supposed that a particular reason he'd enjoyed it so much was the challenge. He knew he could kick with major attacks if he really needed to, and he'd shown it in the war, but it wasn't exactly the most intelligent of roles. Infiltration, in particular, was a challenging and highly entertaining type of mission that he'd been completely unfit for. He'd never even thought about acting and worn his emotions on his sleeves, so going in the complete opposite direction, trying to place himself into the skin of another shinobi, was a whole new experience. After dozens of C-class missions, quite embarrassing, for someone who was effectively a jonin, even if he'd never officially gotten his promotion, he'd finally gotten his skill to acceptable levels, and things had spiraled from there. The B-rank infiltration missions, it turned out, were a lot of fun, his wit was tested to its fullest, and he'd never really had an opportunity to put his pranking habits into action for a practical goal. If you could prank someone with a pot of paint, after all, you could do the same with a kunai. Rather more permanent and messy, but you couldn't argue with results. After a long string of successes, even more so than C rank, he got bored, and inevitably went out of character. Back then, he was finally assigned his first solo A rank, and then, he'd fallen in love with his profession all over again. Did you fall asleep? Naruto looked up and blinked at his sensei, his broad grin of nostalgia slipping from his face. Kakashi was standing lazily on the fourth's forehead, sticking to the stone with chakra. He raised an eyebrow. You've been staring into space for a few minutes, now. Not really, Kakashi-sensei. I was just thinking about, think quick, Naruto, Dad. He tapped the stone and sighed. Kakashi glanced at Sasuke and Sakura, both of whom were cleaning the other faces. The latter glanced curiously at them, but then returned to her work, scowling slightly. Really? Well, I was sort of thinking about the future, too, Naruto admitted, shrugging. I mean, it'd be really cool if I could learn his techniques, but the first time I use any of them, people will figure out the whole family thing. Plus, I don't want to feel like I'm ripping him off, you know. I'm sure that it'll be fine, Kakashi said with a smile. There are plenty of other things to train too, you know. I'm sure when you're a Chunin or Jonin, you can look up those special techniques. Your ceiling's already getting pretty interesting, maybe you should consider concentrating on that. The village hasn't had a seal master around for a while, not since Jiraiya went and became a hermit. You could be a pretty great one. You are an Uzumaki after all, it's in your blood. I suppose. He glanced at his teammates and frowned. He leaned over to Kakashi. What do I do about this team thing? Sasuke and I couldn't stand each other in academy. I'm sure we'll get in a fight sooner or later. And Sakura, he shuddered. Scary. Don't worry, you'll do fine, Kakashi said, smiling. Next week, or perhaps the day after, we'll go do a C rank mission. That should allow you to spend a little time with your team beyond just the few hours of a boring mission. He glanced at Sasuke. Perhaps you'll be invaluable to have around. Well, at least I can pack all the food into scrolls, Naruto muttered. He suddenly perked up, eyes bright. I just remembered. I wanted to ask you about something. You know the seal I'm working on, right, sensei? Yes, Kakashi answered lazily. What about it? Well, he hesitated. I need to know how a lightning element attack forms, so I can make sure the seal doesn't overload, but I don't know anyone with a lightning nature, really, aside from you. He stared with large puppy eyes at his teacher. Could you show me, please? Kakashi looked at Naruto for a long moment, and then nodded. It would be a good introduction to ninjutsu techniques, I suppose. A bit early, perhaps, but I'm sure the others won't mind. He glanced over the statue and aside from a few smudges, the cleaning was almost finished. Kakashi flashed through a quick succession of hand seals, and the entirety of Naruto's bucket of water shot onto the statue, rinsing it clean in one quick movement. A pretty lame use of a sweetened jutsu, but it worked. He turned to the other two team members and pointed up. Sasuke, Sakura, follow us. Naruto quickly scampered up along the sheer rocks, and Kakashi didn't look surprised, but he definitely stopped and stared for a moment when both Sakura and Sasuke made their way up the rocks in the same manner, the latter with some stumbling. A few moments later they were standing next to their teacher with slight grins as he studied them each in turn. Okay. I missed something. Since when do academy students learn control exercises? Sakura looked away. We didn't. Actually we learned from. She paused and frowned. Naruto. At Kakashi's inquiring gaze, the blonde smiled widely. I learned how to do it ages ago, and yesterday you were hours late, so I got really bored. I showed Sakura-chan and Sasuke how to do it. They were far quicker than me with getting it to work, though. He shook his head in disappointment. You taught two genin the tree walking exercise in a day. Kakashi blinked. Who's supposed to be the sensei here? Naruto scowled, looking vaguely affronted. They're my teammates, right? Maybe it was against whatever silly rules you have for genin teams, but, he smiled quite widely, then. Those who abandon their team are worse than trash, right sensei? Kakashi shook his head tiredly. Moving on, Naruto, if you want to learn anything from this, maybe you should pay close attention now. He turned around to one of the few logs that were placed up here above the monument, for training purposes. They were actually guys, Naruto knew, but he and Kakashi would probably make up for the destruction of one of them with a friendly crazy game, or something. Soon you will be learning ninjutsu, beyond your usual attacks. Sasuke already knows several Kaden techniques. Fire. But there are other natures, and you will likely be learning some of them as you become Chunin. Kakashi shrugged idly. That doesn't mean one should ignore training before that time, though. I remember this, Sakura volunteered. There are 5 elements, right? Fire, water, Kaden, Suiden, Futon, Doden, Raiden, Kakashi rattled off. Also known as fire, water, wind, earth, and lightning. There are others, but we'll leave that for now. These 5 elements form the basis for elemental techniques. Personally, I can use techniques from each element for other reasons. Most ninja only use 1 or 2 elements. I have an affinity for lightning techniques, though, which is why the technique I created is of that element. Creating techniques. Is it similar to making seals? Naruto wondered, though he already knew the answer. His practice with the various superior versions of the Rasengan was quite instructive in that regard. Although there are many things to take into account when making your own technique, they're not quite on the same level as Fuinjutsu, aside from extremely powerful techniques, of course, like my own. He smirked. There is always a risk of injuring yourself when working with particularly volatile combinations of shape and element, but this is all far too complex for you. Kakashi shook his head wearily. I get it, Naruto offered enthusiastically, and all he got was a disbelieving stare from Sasuke. Kakashi tapped on the tree stump, and grasped his wrist. When you use an elemental technique, your chakra is transformed into another element. In this regard it's similar to your seal, Naruto. Transforming chakra into an element you have affinity with is far easier, which is the reason shinobi tend to focus on those. Lightning began crackling around Kakashi's outstretched hand, the sizzling and crackling sound amplifying until it became clear where the technique received its name. The Chidori or 1000 birds formed as a layer of electricity sparked across his skin. With a cry he swung it forward into the log, blasting a hole in it the size of someone's head. That is my original technique, Kakashi said, turning around proudly. Is there a shape transformation element? Naruto wondered, his eyes peeled. He'd never actually inquired about this before. After getting one shoved through his chest, he'd rather lost his enthusiasm for the move. Now, though, that hadn't actually happened yet, and wouldn't, if he had anything to say about it. Elemental transformation is obvious, but it did seem awfully straight-edged. Could you veer off with one of those, or is it pretty much locked in its trajectory after you start your attack? Kakashi looked like a deer in headlights. Why do you think that? Naruto narrowed his eyes. Well, it makes sense, right? If you're only changing it to be a cover of your hand without a specific shape to maintain, it'll lose cohesion at the first sign of. He stopped, and blinked. Oh, that's not really genin stuff, is it? Sakura looked with some amazement at Naruto, and even Sasuke was listening in. I don't even know where I'd look for something like that. What have you been reading, Naruto? Ah. Naruto rubbed the back of his head, glancing at Kakashi. Stuff. Perhaps it's smarter if you read genin level books, instead of jonin level, Kakashi pointed out, shaking his head. Sasuke looked just about ready to explode with questions, and Naruto was fairly sure what he'd ask. After all of this, he'd lower himself to asking the dead last for books, at this point in time. The arrogance was there, but it wasn't quite insane yet. Kakashi continued, oblivious to the interplay. It's really quite impressive, deducing the weakness of my technique from seeing it only a single time. You're not secretly an Uchiha under there, are you? Naruto smiled widely. I'm just that awesome. Now, Are we going to train that awesome ninjutsu or not? Of course not. I'm not an idiot. I wish to speak to the Cage. The guard gulped, staring at the imposing shinobi before him, his chakra almost tangible in the air. Slung on his back was a large scroll, partially covered by a mop of white hair, and his eyes were sharp. The guard composed himself quickly. Did Cage-sama know you were coming, Jiraiya of the Sannin? He knows, Naruto answered, glad to see his disguise was holding up. Tell him that I bring 2 crows. He will confirm my invitation. Yes, please wait here. Naruto smiled, realizing that he'd missed even Suna's harsh weather. A little, annoying as it often was, he'd spent quite a bit of time here with Gaara and his family, and it had always been a blast. Now he'd be walking into the belly of the beast, though. Daiki, 4th Cage of Suna, was a dangerous man, and Naruto would have to be lying flat to his face the entire time. Well, he did always enjoy infiltration missions, and this counted. A- rank, perhaps. S rank. A small grin made it onto his face as he saw the shinobi returning. This would be fun.